Some places hold on to their secrets, where the wind carries whispers of events that defy explanation. Here, in the vast, silent landscapes of the North, the line between what is real and what is not can become dangerously thin. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously? The ice runway. The world outside the cockpit of the Douglas DC-6 was an endless, unforgiving expanse of white, a canvas of snow and ice stretching to a horizon that had blurred into the low, heavy sky. For Captain Evan Hayes, a cargo pilot with over 2 decades of experience flying the Alaskan interior, this was just another Tuesday in February of 1998. His run was a familiar one, hauling essential supplies from Anchorage to the remote hub of Bethel, a town that relied on air transport for its very survival. The old plane, a 4-engine workhorse he affectionately called the Beast, droned on with a comforting mechanical rhythm that had been the soundtrack to most of his adult life. He was a man of checklists and procedures, a pragmatist who trusted his instruments more than his own eyes, especially in the deceptive landscapes of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. The approach to Bethel in winter was always a challenge, requiring absolute precision. The town's seasonal runway wasn't paved asphalt, but a strip of heavily compacted snow and ice, carved directly onto the frozen surface of a river. Its edges were marked not by painted lines, but by a series of low-wattage electric stakes that were often caked in rime ice, their glow diffused and hazy. The weather report was typical for the season: light snow and ice fog, visibility dropping but still well within legal landing minimums. Evan completed his pre-landing checklist, his gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency across the glowing dials and switches of the aging cockpit. He could feel the cold seeping through the fuselage, a deep, penetrating chill that no heater could fully vanquish. He radioed the Bethel Tower, his voice calm and professional. The controller, a young woman whose voice sounded tired even over the crackle of the radio, confirmed his approach path and gave him the latest wind conditions. Everything was normal. Everything was by the book. As he began his final descent, piercing through the thin layer of ice fog, the runway lights appeared ahead, 2 faint parallel lines against the deepening twilight. He adjusted his course, his eyes scanning from the instruments to the view outside and back again. But something was wrong. Something his brain couldn't immediately process. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, thinking it was a trick of the fog or simple fatigue from the long flight. The runway lights were doubled. There weren't just 2 lines of lights, but 4. 2 distinct, perfectly parallel runways sat side by side, separated by about 200 feet of dark, unbroken ice. One set of lights was steady and familiar, the familiar pale yellow glow he expected. The other set, the one to his left, seemed to shimmer, its light having a strange, almost liquid quality to it, like a heat haze rising from a desert road. But this was the Arctic. There was no heat, only a profound and absolute cold. He keyed the mic, his voice tight, trying to keep the confusion from showing. Bethel Tower, this is Cargo 6904. Can you confirm the status of your runway lighting? I'm seeing a double set of lights on my approach. The controller's response was immediate, laced with a hint of puzzlement. Negative, 6904. We have 1 active runway. Standard edge lighting is on. No other aircraft or vehicles are on the field. You're cleared to land on runway 19er. Evan's heart began to beat a little faster. He was a pilot, a man who believed in physics and engineering. not ghosts. Ice fog was known to play tricks with light, creating mirages and halos. It had to be a refraction phenomenon, a simple illusion caused by ice crystals in the air. Yet, the false runway was perfectly formed, its dimensions and spacing an exact mirror of the real one. It didn't waver or flicker like a typical mirage. It was just there. As he drew closer, the shimmering quality of the phantom lights became more pronounced. They seemed to writhe with a faint, silvery energy, casting an eerie glow on the ice beneath them that the real runway lights did not. A deep, instinctual unease settled in his gut. His training screamed at him to trust the tower, to trust his instruments, which showed him perfectly aligned with the runway on the right. But his eyes were telling him something else entirely. The phantom runway looked more inviting, its lights brighter, clearer. It felt like a siren's call, a silent invitation to a place that shouldn't exist. He gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. The plane was descending steadily, the altimeter unwinding. He had to make a decision. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive for 20 years in this hostile environment, focused on the steady, unassuming lights of the real runway. He ignored the shimmering lure to his left, keeping the DC-6 aligned with the coordinates the tower had given him. For a few terrifying seconds, as the plane sank lower, it felt like he was flying into the darkness between the two runways. The shimmering lights of the false one grew brighter, more intense, as if in protest. The air in the cockpit felt colder, the drone of the engines seeming to thin and recede. He could almost feel a pressure against the left side of the fuselage, a strange, invisible force trying to push him off course. He fought it, his muscles tense, his eyes locked on the correct landing strip. The cockpit video recorder, a small black box mounted above the dashboard, was running silently, capturing everything. It was standard procedure, a tool for incident analysis. At that moment, Evan was certain he was creating an incident to be analyzed. The moment the wheels of the DC-6 touched down on the solid, reassuring ice of the correct runway, the phantom runway vanished. It didn't fade or flicker out. It was simply gone, as if a switch had been thrown. One moment there were 4 lines of light, and the next, just 2. The relief that washed over him was so intense, it left him lightheaded. He taxied the aircraft to the small terminal, the engines winding down with a series of tired groans. When he finally stepped out of the cockpit and onto the tarmac, the air was still and brutally cold. The sky a dark, star-dusted velvet. There was only one runway, its lights casting long, lonely shadows on the snow. The ground crew saw how pale he was and asked if the landing had been rough. He just shook his head, unable to articulate the experience. He filed an official incident report with the FAA, a dry, technical document that described the visual anomaly. The official explanation, as noted in the report from February 1998, was a rare form of atmospheric lensing, a trick of the ice fog. But Evan knew what he had seen. He requested the footage from the cockpit video recorder. When he watched it back in a small, quiet office, his blood ran cold. The video clearly showed the 2 runways, just as he had seen them. The shimmering, ethereal quality of the false one was captured in perfect detail. He watched himself make the approach, fighting an invisible drift to the left. Then, he saw the moment his wheels made contact. In a single frame, the false runway is there, bright and vivid. In the very next frame, it is gone, leaving only the dark, empty ice. He quit flying cargo routes to the deep interior after that. He took a desk job in Anchorage, training younger pilots. He never told anyone the full story. The feeling of that phantom runway trying to pull him in. He knew they would just talk about ice fog and pilot fatigue, but sometimes on cold, clear nights, he would look at the footage again. He would pause on that final frame, the one just before landing, and stare at the shimmering, impossible lights. He would wonder what lay at the end of that runway. What would have happened if he had chosen to land there, on that perfect, welcoming strip of ice that wasn't real? The FAA incident report officially closed the case. But for Evan Hayes, the mystery of the ice runway would haunt his waking hours and his dreams, a chilling reminder of a moment when the world he knew briefly overlapped with another, a colder, darker place that waited just beyond the veil of the fog. The canceled call for Anya Sharma, the night shift at the Anchorage 911 dispatch center, was a familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. The room was a cocoon of technology, a darkened space filled with the soft glow of monitors and the low hum of servers, a stark contrast to the vast, untamed wilderness that surrounded the city. Anya was a professional, her voice a calm, steady anchor for people on the worst day of their lives. She could handle anything from a fender bender on the Glen Highway to a bear encounter in a suburban backyard. She navigated the city through her screens, her world a grid of maps, call logs, and radio frequencies. It was a world that made sense, a world governed by procedure and protocol. The night of October 12th, 2011, began like any other. The calls were routine, the radio chatter predictable. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a new call lit up her console. The line was staticky, the connection poor, but what caught her attention was the source ID. It was listed as a payphone, a relic from another era. The location was flagged near Ship Creek, in a desolate industrial area under the shadow of the port. She answered with her standard, placid greeting. Anchorage 911. What's the address of your emergency? The voice on the other end was muffled, indistinct, like someone speaking through a thick cloth. It was accompanied by a strange, watery, gurgling sound. She could make out a few words, frantic and desperate. Ambulance! Down by the water! Hurry! Anya's training kicked in. She tried to get more information, to pinpoint the location, but the voice just repeated the same fragmented plea. The line was filled with so much static it sounded like it was coming from an immense distance, not from just a few miles away. After a few more seconds of unintelligible whispering, the line went dead. She immediately dispatched a patrol car to the area, citing a possible medical emergency. The officer who arrived at the scene radioed back 20 minutes later, his voice filled with confusion. He had found the payphone booth. It was exactly where the system said it would be. A rusted, graffiti-covered box standing alone under a flickering street lamp. But the phone itself was gone. The handset had been torn out years ago, the armored cord severed. The coin slot was jammed with debris. Inside the booth, there was nothing but a tangle of cut wires hanging from the backboard. There was no one in the area, no sign of anyone in distress. Anya stared at her screen, a cold knot forming in her stomach. It had to be a technical glitch, a crossed wire somewhere in the city's aging copper network. She logged the incident as a system error and tried to put it out of her mind. But the next night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same line lit up her console. The same payphone ID, the same location. This time, when she answered, the voice was slightly clearer, though still distant and distorted. It was a man's voice, laced with panic. "He's not breathing. Send help. Ship Creek." The call ended abruptly, just like before. Again, she sent a unit. Again, they found the same empty, derelict phone booth. This became a horrifying ritual. Every night for a week, at the same precise time, a call would come from the dead phone. Anya started dreading that moment, the way the specific line on her console would illuminate with an eerie green light. She began recording the calls, listening to them over and over, trying to decipher the muffled words. The background noise was always the same, a sound like rushing water mixed with a low, crackling static. The voices were always panicked, always begging for an ambulance, always near Ship Creek. She escalated the issue, bringing it to her supervisor. A team of technicians was sent out. They spent an entire day at the payphone booth, running diagnostics on the underground lines. Their report, as logged with the Anchorage Police Department, was definitive. The line associated with that phone had been physically disconnected from the central exchange in 2004. There was no electrical current running to it, no signal, no possible way it could be generating a call. It was a dead line, a ghost in the machine. Yet, the calls kept coming. On the seventh night, Anya sat at her console, waiting. The clock ticked past 2:16 a.m. Her hands were clammy, her heart pounding against her ribs. At 2:17 a.m., the line lit up. She took a deep breath and answered. This time, there was no static. The line was crystal clear, the silence on the other end absolute and profound. Then, a voice spoke, so close and clear it felt like it was whispering directly in her ear. It was a different voice, a woman, her tone filled with an ancient, weary sadness. "It's too late," she said softly. "You're always too late." And then the line went dead. The call never came again. The line on Anya's console from the Ship Creek payphone remained dark, but the incident left a permanent scar on her professional calm. She had spent her career believing in the predictable logic of her systems, in the clear lines of communication that connected her to a world of solvable problems. That week in October shattered her certainty. She had become a bridge to something else, a voice from a place that technology could not explain and procedure could not contain. She pulled the municipal archives, searching for any major incidents around Ship Creek. She found a small news clipping from the late 1970s about a car that had lost control on an icy overpass and plunged into the frigid, fast-moving waters of the creek. 2 people had died, their bodies not recovered for several days. There was no mention of a 911 call. Payphones were common then, but the system was far less sophisticated. There was no way to know if they had tried to call for help. Anya never forgot the voices from the canceled call. Sometimes, during a momentary silence between emergencies, she would think she could hear them. A faint, muffled plea for help, buried deep within the electronic hum of the dispatch center. The official communications log lists the events as an unresolved network anomaly. But for Anya, it was proof that some lines of communication never truly go dead. They just wait in the silence, endlessly repeating a call that was never answered in time. A ghostly echo in a system that has long since forgotten them. The tunnel draft. Mark Coleman was a man who understood the earth. As a highway inspector for the Alaska Department of Transportation, his job was to know the stresses and strains of rock and steel, the subtle ways that geology and engineering waged a constant, silent war. His current assignment, in March of 2005, was a routine inspection of the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel. a marvel of modern engineering that bored for 2.5 miles through the solid rock of Maynard Mountain. The tunnel was unique, a single lane that accommodated both cars and trains, with traffic flowing in one direction for 15 minutes, then switching to the other. It was a place of perpetual twilight, a concrete artery connecting the port of Whittier to the rest of Alaska. Mark was there to check the ventilation systems, massive fans designed to pull fresh air in and push exhaust fumes out. It was a straightforward job, one he'd done a dozen times before. He drove his DOT truck into the tunnel during a scheduled closure, the heavy steel doors sealing behind him with a deep, resonant boom that echoed down the long passage. The air immediately grew still and cold, the only sound the hum of the emergency lights and the drip of water seeping through the rock. He parked his truck and began his inspection, starting with the massive jet fans mounted on the ceiling. According to the control room, the ventilation system was set to pull air from the Whittier side and push it towards the Portage side, flowing with the last direction of traffic. But as Mark stood on a catwalk near the tunnel's midpoint, he felt a distinct, frigid draft blowing against him, coming from the Portage side, directly opposing the powerful fans. It was a strong, steady wind, cold enough to bite at his exposed skin, and it made no sense. He checked his anemometer, a device for measuring wind speed. It confirmed a steady 20-mile-per-hour gust blowing against the engineered airflow. He radioed the control room operator. "Hey, Bill, can you double-check the ventilation settings for me? I'm getting a strong headwind in here." Bill's voice crackled back, confused. "That's impossible, Mark. I'm looking at the board right now. All fans are operational, pushing air west to east. You should have a tailwind." Mark ran his gloved hand along the cold, damp concrete wall. The draft was undeniable, a river of cold air flowing from the heart of the mountain. He dismissed it as a strange pressure anomaly, something the complex topography of the Chugach Mountains could easily create. He continued his inspection, using a handheld digital recorder to log his audio notes. He described the condition of the concrete, the state of the electrical conduits, his voice a flat monotone in the echoing silence. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, the draft intensified. The cold became a physical presence, seeping into his bones. It carried a low, mournful sound with it, a faint whistling that he attributed to the air moving past steel supports. But the sound began to change, to take on a strange, rhythmic quality. It started to sound less like wind and more like whispering. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. The sound was faint, just on the edge of hearing, a chorus of hushed, sibilant voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. He raised the audio recorder. "Note," he said, his own voice sounding loud and intrusive. "Unusual acoustic resonance noted in the central section. Sounds like wind, but it's patterned." He felt a fool even saying it. He was an engineer, a man of data and measurements. But the feeling in the tunnel was shifting. The familiar, sterile environment was becoming something else, something ancient and oppressive. He felt a primal sense of being watched, not by cameras, but by the rock itself. The mountain was aware of him. He tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the job. He checked the pressure sensors, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. The sensors confirmed his initial reading. The atmospheric pressure at the Portage end of the tunnel was significantly higher than at the Whittier end, creating a natural wind tunnel that was overpowering the multi-million-dollar ventilation system. The mountain was, for all intents and purposes, exhaling. The whispering grew louder, the voices clearer, though the words remained incomprehensible. They seemed to be coming from the rock walls around him, as if the stone itself was speaking. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He felt small and insignificant, a trespasser in a place far older and more powerful than any human construction. He retreated to his truck, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. The whispers seemed to follow him, swirling in the unnatural draft. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, and just listened. The sound was undeniable now, a multitude of voices rising and falling in a sad, lonely cadence. It was the sound of a crowd, but a crowd of ghosts. He started the truck, the roar of the diesel engine shattering the oppressive silence. He didn't finish his inspection. He drove to the portage end of the tunnel and waited for the massive door to open, feeling a desperate need for open sky. The moment he drove out into the gray afternoon light, the draft in the tunnel ceased. He knew because he called the control room, and a relieved-sounding bill told him that all pressure readings had suddenly returned to normal. The system was functioning exactly as it should. The mountain had stopped breathing. When Mark returned to his office, he played back his audio notes. The recording was mostly clear, his own voice narrating his findings. But in the background, beneath his words, he could hear it. The whispering. It was faint, but unmistakable. He let his supervisor listen. His boss, a grizzled veteran of the DOT, just shrugged. "That's just wind, Mark. This tunnel does weird things with sound. It's famous for it." The official report, filed in March of 2005, mentions the pressure anomaly but dismisses the auditory phenomena as resonance. But Mark knew it was more than that. He had the recordings, the faint, ghostly voices trapped on a digital file. He never volunteered for a solo inspection of the tunnel again. He couldn't shake the memory of that profound, impossible cold, or the feeling of the mountain's stony gaze upon him. He knew that for a few hours, on a routine inspection, he had stood in the path of something ancient, being exhaled from the deep rock. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was old, and it was lonely, and it was still in there, waiting for the next time the mountain decided to speak. The unmoored buoy, the sea off the coast of Homer, Alaska, is a place of raw, untamed beauty and unforgiving power. For Jedediah, Jed Stone, a harbor worker with hands as calloused as old leather and a face weathered by years of salty wind, it was simply home. His days in July of 2003 were a familiar routine of securing lines, fueling boats, and keeping the bustling Homer Spit Marina in working order. He knew the rhythms of the tides, the moods of the water, and the unique groan of every vessel in the harbor. One gray overcast morning, as a thick fog rolled in from Kachemak Bay, obscuring the distant glaciers, Jed noticed something unusual. A large channel marker buoy, rusted and battered, was drifting slowly towards the docks. This was strange in itself. These buoys were anchored with thousands of pounds of concrete and chain, designed to withstand the worst storms the Gulf of Alaska could throw at them. But what was even stranger was that he didn't recognize it. He knew every aid to navigation in the bay, their numbers and patterns as familiar to him as the streets of his own town. This one was a stranger. It was a bellbuoy, its large metal frame housing a clapper that should have been ringing mournfully in the swell. But it was silent. Its paint was almost entirely gone, peeled away by decades of exposure, leaving a surface of deep orange rust that seemed to bleed into the water. As it drifted closer, propelled by the incoming tide, Jed managed to snag it with a grappling hook, his muscles straining as he pulled the heavy, waterlogged object towards the pier. He tied it off, the buoy bumping against the pilings with a dull, hollow thud. He looked for an identification plate, but the metal was so corroded as to be completely unreadable. The buoy felt wrong. It had an aura of profound age and neglect about it, as if it had been lost at sea not for years, but for generations. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic pinging sound. It was coming from the buoy itself. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the cold, wet metal. It was a radio signal, a simple, repeating pulse. It sounded like a beacon, the kind used to signal that a channel was clear and shit and safe for passage. Puzzled, he called the local Coast Guard station. He described the buoy, its condition, its location. The petty officer on the other end was equally perplexed. He checked the active aids to navigation logs. There were no reports of a missing buoy in their sector. He asked Jed if he could get any identifying marks. Jed scraped away some of the rust with his knife, uncovering a few deeply stamped letters, but not enough to form a coherent number. The officer promised to dig into the archives. Meanwhile, Jed couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The silent bell, the impossible drift, the ghost-like radio signal. The buoy felt like a messenger from a forgotten time. The fog thickened, enveloping the marina in a damp, gray shroud, muffling all sound except for the gentle lapping of water and the persistent, faint pinging from the rusted hulk tied to the dock. The sound was getting under his skin, a patient, electronic heartbeat in the oppressive silence. An hour later, the Coast Guard called back. The officer's voice was tinged with disbelief. They had cross-referenced the partial markings with old, decommissioned logs. The buoy was from a series that had been retired in the early 1970s. According to their records, this specific buoy had been reported lost in a severe winter storm in 1974, presumed sunk in the deep waters of the Cook Inlet. It had been officially written off the books for nearly 30 years, and its radio beacon, powered by what should have been long-dead batteries, was transmitting a channel-clear signal on a frequency that was no longer used. The buoy was a ghost, a piece of marine hardware that had returned from a watery grave. The decision was made to haul it out of the water for inspection. Jed and a few other workers used a small crane to lift the buoy onto the dock. As it rose from the water, trailing seaweed and slime, a deep groaning sound came from within its metal shell. It settled onto the concrete with a heavy, final-sounding clang. The pinging stopped the moment it left the water. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the sound itself. The inspection crew arrived, their curiosity piqued by the strange story. They examined the buoy from top to bottom. The corrosion was even worse up close. It was a miracle the thing was still floating. The most baffling discovery came when they decided to cut it open to see the state of the beacon's internal mechanics. They used a plasma cutter, the bright, searing flame a stark contrast to the gray, damp air. As they cut through the final section of metal, they expected to find the rusted remnants of batteries, wires, and transmitters. Instead, they found nothing. The buoy was completely hollow. There was no machinery, no power source, no beacon. There was nothing inside but the stale, salty air and a thick layer of rust. The faint radio signal that Jed and the Coast Guard had both heard had been generated by an empty, derelict shell. There was no rational explanation. The official USCG log from July 2003 simply notes the recovery of a derelict, unidentified aid to navigation. It offers no explanation for the phantom radio signal. The hollow buoy was eventually sent to a scrapyard, its strange journey finally over. But Jedstone never forgot it. He would often stand on the docks, looking out at the fog-shrouded bay, and think about the unmoored buoy. He wondered where it had been for all those years, drifting alone in the vast, dark expanse of the North Pacific. And he wondered what it was that had been pinging from inside its empty shell, a lonely, impossible signal from a place no one had heard from in 30 years, a clear channel to a destination that no longer existed. It was a message from the deep, a reminder that the sea never truly gives up its dead, and that sometimes they find their own way back home. The Juneau Tram Halt. The Mount Roberts Tramway is a jewel of Juneau, a pair of bright red gondolas that glide silently up the steep, forested mountainside, offering breathtaking views of the city and the Gastineau Channel below. For Amelia, a young operator working a summer job in August of 2018, it was the best office in the world. Her post was in the upper terminal, a modern building perched 1,800 feet above sea level. But her job involved constant communication with the cars as they made their ascent and descent. The system was a model of Swiss precision, a complex dance of cables, motors, and sensors that ran with flawless reliability. The weather that afternoon was moody and dramatic, with dark rain clouds rolling in from the coast, shrouding the peak in a thick, swirling mist. It was the kind of weather that often deterred tourists, so the descending car, Car 1, was carrying only a small family of 4. Amelia watched its progress on her monitor, a small red icon creeping down the digital representation of the cable line. Everything was normal. Then, without any warning, the system shut down. Alarms blared in the control room. The icon on her screen froze halfway down the mountain. The massive bullwheel that drove the cables groaned to a halt. Amelia's heart leaped into her throat. She immediately ran through the emergency checklist. She checked the power grid. It was stable. She checked the motor diagnostics. No faults reported. She checked the wind speed sensors, well within safe operating limits. There was no logical reason for the system to have performed an emergency stop. She keyed her radio, her voice tight with professional calm. Car 1, this is Mountaintop. We're showing a system halt. Are you all right? The voice that came back was from the cabin attendant, a college student named Ben. He sounded shaken. We're okay up here, Amelia. We just stopped. It was a hard jolt. The passengers are scared, Amelia tried to reassure him. Okay, Ben. Just keep them calm. We're working on a system restart. Stand by. But the system wouldn't restart. The computer console was frozen, unresponsive. It was as if the tram had simply decided to stop, suspended in the thick, gray void between the two terminals. Below, the city of Juneau was completely obscured by the clouds. The gondola was an isolated bubble, hanging silently in the mist, hundreds of feet above the steep, unforgiving terrain. Then Ben's voice came over the radio again, his voice now a panicked whisper. Amelia? There's something on the roof. We can hear it. Amelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What do you mean, Ben? What kind of sound? Tapping, he whispered. It sounds like someone is tapping on the roof, right above my head. The roof of the gondola was smooth, curved metal. There was nothing to hold on to, nothing to stand on. A bird, maybe? A loose piece of equipment? She tried to rationalize it, her mind racing through the possibilities. She switched her monitor to the live security feed from the camera mounted on the exterior of Car 1. The image was grainy, distorted by the thick fog, but she could see the cable stretching out into the white emptiness. There was nothing on the roof, nothing around the car at all. It was utterly alone in the mist. I don't see anything on the camera, Ben. she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but it's probably just ice falling from the line. No, he insisted, his voice cracking. This is different. It's rhythmic. It's moving. The tapping continued, audible even as a faint, tinny sound over the radio. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, methodical. Then, precisely 90 seconds after the tram had halted, the security feed from Car 1 went black. A signal lost message flashed on Amelia's screen. The radio went silent. For a minute and a half, there was nothing. No video, no audio, no data. The gondola had simply vanished from her senses. Amelia felt a surge of pure terror. She was about to hit the emergency alarm that would contact search and rescue when, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the system came back to life. The alarms in the control room fell silent. The bull wheel began to turn. The icon on her screen started moving again. The video feed flickered back on, showing the same empty, fog-shrouded view. The radio crackled. Mountaintop. This is Car 1. We're moving again. It was Ben. His voice was trembling. What happened, Amelia? What was that? She had no answer. The system diagnostics showed no record of the shutdown. It was as if the last 3 minutes had never happened. The tram completed its descent without further incident. When the gondola arrived at the base terminal, it was immediately taken out of service for a full inspection. The passengers, a pale and shaken family, spoke of the terrifying, inexplicable halt and the strange, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from all around them in the fog. The maintenance crew went over every inch of the car. They found nothing. No damage, no signs of impact, no loose parts. The roof was clean, untouched. The official service log for August 2018 records the event as an unexplained system freeze, likely caused by a sudden voltage drop or electromagnetic interference from the brewing storm. The 90-second blackout of the security feed was attributed to a temporary signal failure. But Amelia knew that wasn't the whole story. She had listened to the fear in Ben's voice, had felt the profound wrongness of that silent, 90-second void. She reviewed the control room's own security footage. It showed her at her console, her face etched with worry. It also showed the tram's icon on the monitor, frozen in place. But when she synced the timestamp with the camera from Car 1, she found the gap. 90 seconds of footage from the control room that corresponded to a complete blank from the gondola. It was 90 seconds that the system, and whatever was outside in the fog, had simply erased. She quit her job at the end of the summer. She could no longer look at the red cars gliding up the mountain without feeling a knot of dread. She would remember the image of that lonely gondola suspended in the mist, and she would hear the faint, ghostly tapping, a sound that had no source and no explanation, a quiet, patient knocking on the door of a small, fragile world hanging precariously over the void. The frozen marina. The month of November in Seward, Alaska, is a time of transition, a slow descent into the long, dark winter. The fishing fleet is mostly tied up. The tourist season is a distant memory, and a quiet stillness settles over the small coastal town. For Liam O'Connell, a young dockhand at the Seward Small Boat Harbor, it was the time of year for maintenance and preparation. His days were spent checking lines, mending nets, and ensuring the boats were secure against the coming ice. The weather in early November of 1994 had been unusually mild. The temperatures hovered consistently above freezing, and the waters of Resurrection Bay remained a deep, unfrozen gray. There was no sign of the ice that would typically be starting to form along the shoreline. On the morning of November 17th, Liam arrived at the marina just before dawn, the sky a pale, bruised purple. He was met with a sight that made him stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The entire marina, every single slip, was frozen solid. It wasn't just a thin skim of ice. It was a thick, solid sheet of it, milky white and opaque, locking dozens of boats in its grip. The ice was perfectly smooth, almost like a pane of glass, extending from the shore out to the end of the longest dock. Vessels that should have been gently bobbing in the water were held fast, their hulls encased in a frosty prison. Liam stared in disbelief. He pulled out his phone and checked the weather. The overnight low had been 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees above freezing. It was impossible. Salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water, and even then, it requires a prolonged period of sub-zero temperatures to freeze a body of water this large and deep so completely. He walked to the edge of the dock, his boots crunching on the frost-covered planks. He stomped his heel on the ice. It was as solid as concrete. He could see the dark shapes of the boats beneath the surface, suspended and motionless. A feeling of profound wrongness crept over him. The silence was the most unnerving part. The marina was usually alive with sound. The creak of lines, the cry of gulls, the gentle slap of water against hulls. Now, there was only a dead, oppressive quiet. The ice had smothered all sound, all movement. He called the port authority, his voice shaky. The harbor master, a gruff old sailor named George, was just as baffled. He arrived minutes later, his face a mask of incredulity as he surveyed the scene. "I've been in Seward for 50 years," George muttered, his voice a low rumble. "I've never seen anything like this, not even in the dead of January." They spent the morning trying to make sense of it. They checked every official weather station in the area. None had recorded temperatures anywhere near freezing. They took a sample of the water from an unfrozen section outside the harbor breakwater. Its salinity was normal. The phenomenon was confined entirely to the marina, as if an invisible wall had contained an instantaneous, localized freeze. Boat owners began to arrive, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. Their vessels, their livelihoods, were trapped. They tried to break the ice with poles and hooks, but it was too thick, too strong. It was as if the harbor had been flash frozen in a single, silent moment during the night. The day wore on, and the mystery only deepened. There was no scientific explanation, no meteorological phenomenon that could account for what they were seeing. The local news station sent a camera crew, filming the bizarre spectacle of boats locked in ice under a relatively mild autumn sky. As the weak afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains, something even stranger happened. The ice began to melt, but it didn't melt in the way ice normally does, slowly turning to slush and then to water. It simply vanished. One moment, the boats were encased in a solid sheet. The next, a crack would appear, and a section of ice would disappear, leaving behind the dark, open water. It happened in patches, a rapid, unnatural thaw that spread across the harbor. Within an hour, all the ice was gone. There was no trace of it. No floating chunks, no slushy residue. The boats were bobbing freely in their slips again. The gulls were crying overhead, and the familiar sounds of the marina had returned. It was as if the entire event had been a collective hallucination. The official port authority note from that day is brief and clinical. describing an unexplained rapid freezing and subsequent thawing event. It offers no conclusion, no explanation. It is a simple statement of an impossible fact. For the people who were there, the experience was anything but clinical. Liam O'Connell never looked at the waters of the bay the same way again. He had witnessed a moment when the fundamental laws of nature had been suspended. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something ancient and powerful at work, a force that lived in the deep, cold water and that had, for a few brief hours, decided to show its hand. He would forever be haunted by the memory of that profound, unnatural silence. The image of the boats locked in their icy tombs. It was a reminder that the world he thought he knew was just a thin surface, and that beneath it, in the cold, dark depths, things operated by a different set of rules. Rules that were ancient, unknowable, and utterly indifferent to human understanding. The frozen marina of 1994 became a piece of local folklore, a strange story told on dark winter nights. But for Liam, it was a memory, a chilling certainty that the water was not just water, that it was alive, and that it held a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The Lost Radio Room. The Kodiak Coast Guard Base is a lonely outpost, a bastion of order and discipline clinging to the edge of a vast, wild island. For Cadet Leo Jensen, a fresh-faced recruit from the Midwest, it was an intimidating and awe-inspiring place. It was December of 1982, and his assignment was a simple but tedious one: to inventory the equipment in the base's older, semi-retired communications wing. This part of the station was a labyrinth of quiet hallways and dusty rooms filled with outdated technology, a museum of analog dials, vacuum tubes, and massive transmitters that had long since been replaced by digital systems. The air was thick with the smell of old electronics and stale coffee. Most of the equipment was powered down, but some of the receivers were kept on a low-power standby, just in case. Leo worked his way through the rooms, meticulously logging serial numbers onto a clipboard. He eventually found himself in a small, forgotten radio room at the end of a long corridor. It was packed with vintage gear from the 1950s, heavy, metal-cased radios with large, glowing frequency displays. He was about to mark the room as complete when a strange sound caught his attention. It was a voice, faint and crackling, coming from one of the old receivers. He leaned closer. The radio was tuned to a frequency he didn't recognize, one that was supposedly no longer in use. The voice was calm, authoritative, and distinctly from another era. It had the clipped, formal tone of a mid-century military broadcast. Report to Training Grid Zulu Niner. All hands prepare for deep water drills. The cutter Storis is to maintain radio silence until further notice. Acknowledge. Leo frowned. The USCGC Storis was a famous ship, a veteran of World War II, but it had been decommissioned and turned into a museum vessel years ago. He fiddled with the dial, trying to get a clearer signal. The static lessened, and the broadcast continued, a steady stream of what sounded like routine training orders. He heard call signs for ships that hadn't sailed in decades, references to procedures that were long obsolete. The broadcast was a ghost, a perfect, clear transmission from the height of the Cold War. Thinking it must be some kind of historical recording being broadcast by a local enthusiast, he began to log the transmission times and the content of the messages. His curiosity piqued. The broadcast was on a continuous loop, repeating the same set of orders every 15 minutes. It was precise, professional, and utterly out of place. He spent over an hour in that room, captivated by the strange window into the past. He even used his own small tape recorder to capture a sample of the audio. The disembodied voice from the 1950s, now trapped on a cassette tape. The feeling in the room was strange. It wasn't scary, but it was deeply uncanny. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy. It felt like he had stumbled into a place where time had become unstuck. Finally, he decided he had to report it. It was a non-standard transmission on a restricted frequency, something his supervisors would need to know about. He went to find his commanding officer, a grizzled chief petty officer with a skeptical frown permanently etched on his face. When Leo explained what he had found, the CPO just sighed, clearly annoyed at being bothered by a new recruit's wild goose chase. He followed Leo back to the old communications wing, 2 other senior officers in tow, but when they entered the small radio room, there was only silence. The receiver was still on, its vacuum tubes glowing warmly, the frequency dial exactly where Leo had left it. But the airwaves were dead, filled with nothing but a soft, empty hiss. Leo's face flushed. "It was here," he insisted. "I was listening to it for over an hour. It was training orders from 1953. The CPO shot him a withering look. "Son, there's nothing on this band. It's been decommissioned since the 70s. You were probably picking up atmospheric bleed from some Russian fishing trawler." Leo fumbled for his tape recorder. "No, I recorded it. Listen." He pressed play. The tape hissed for a moment, and then his own voice filled the small room, a nervous narration of what he was hearing. But when it came to the part where the ghostly broadcast should have been, there was nothing. The recording had captured his voice perfectly, but the radio transmission itself was completely absent, replaced by a strange, low hum on the tape. He was mortified. He looked like a fool, a kid hearing voices in the static. The officers left, shaking their heads, leaving him alone in the silent, dusty room. He knew what he had heard. It had been as clear and real as the voice of the CPO. But now, all the evidence was gone. The broadcast had vanished the moment he brought others to witness it. The official memo filed by his supervisor mentions that a cadet reported a possible signal anomaly, which was investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. It suggests that atmospheric ducting, a phenomenon where radio waves can bounce off the atmosphere and travel vast distances, might have caused a temporary bleed-over from a distant foreign broadcast. But Leo knew that wasn't it. The broadcast had been in perfect, unaccented English. It had used Coast Guard-specific call signs and terminology. It hadn't been a foreign signal. It had been one of their own, a transmission from their own past, echoing in a room that time had forgotten. He never went back to that part of the base. He finished his tour on Kodiak and eventually left the service, but the memory of that lost radio room stayed with him. He was left with a chilling question that had no answer. Had he found a glitch in the airwaves? A simple trick of physics? Or had he stumbled into a place where the past had never truly ended? A room where the men of 1953 were still diligently standing watch, their voices forever broadcasting orders to ships that were now nothing but rust and memory. Their signals, traveling not across the ocean but across the years. The experience taught him a profound lesson, that some signals, once sent, never truly stop broadcasting. They just wait in the silence for someone to accidentally tune to the right frequency. The weather balloon photo. In the small town of Wasilla, Alaska, the winter sky is a vast and often dramatic canvas. For Mr. David Chen, a dedicated high school science teacher, it was also a laboratory. In January of 2017, he and his advanced physics class embarked on their favorite annual project, launching a high-altitude weather balloon. The goal was simple: to send a payload of sensors and a specially modified digital camera into the upper atmosphere to capture data and images of the curvature of the Earth. The students were buzzing with excitement, their faces flushed from the biting cold as they gathered in a snow-covered field outside the school. They carefully attached the payload, a small styrofoam box, to the large, helium-filled balloon. The camera was programmed to take a picture every 30 seconds. With a final countdown, they released it. The balloon shot upwards, a tiny white sphere against the brilliant blue of the Arctic sky, and was quickly lost to sight. For the next 2 hours, the students tracked its progress using a small GPS transmitter, watching on a laptop as it ascended, traveling east on the high-altitude winds. It reached its peak altitude of just over 90,000 feet, well into the stratosphere, before the balloon burst as planned. The payload, attached to a small parachute, then began its long, slow descent back to Earth. The recovery was part of the adventure. The GPS signal led them to a dense, silent birch forest, about 20 miles from the launch site. They found the styrofoam box half buried in a deep snowdrift, perfectly intact. Back in the warmth of the classroom, the students eagerly downloaded the data. The sensors had worked perfectly, charting the dramatic drop in temperature and pressure. Then, they downloaded the images from the camera. The first few hundred photos were spectacular. They showed the ground receding, the familiar shapes of their town and the surrounding mountains shrinking into a topographical map. As the balloon climbed higher, the photos showed the blackness of space beginning to creep in at the top of the frame, the sky shifting from blue to a deep, dark indigo. The thin line of the atmosphere was a brilliant blue curve against the void. The students scrolled through the images, awestruck. Then they came to frame number 437. The photo was taken at the balloon's maximum altitude. The image should have shown the blackness of space, the curve of the Earth, and the brilliant, unfiltered glare of the sun. It did. But it also showed something else. Standing in the upper right quadrant of the photo was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its form indistinct and dark against the blinding sunlight. It appeared to be standing on a solid surface, a patch of what looked like wind-blown snow, at an altitude where there should be nothing but thin, unbreathable air. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothing. It was just a silhouette, a stark, impossible shape in a place where nothing could live. The students fell silent, staring at the image on the large projector screen. Mr. Chen felt a cold dread wash over him. He immediately thought of a camera malfunction, a lens flare, a smudge on the lens. He zoomed in. The figure remained, its edges unnervingly sharp. It wasn't a glare. It looked solid. He quickly scrolled to the next frame, taken 30 seconds later. The figure was gone. The view was once again the empty, majestic panorama of space and the Earth below. He checked the frames before and after. Frame 436 was normal. Frame 438 was normal. Only in that one single photograph did the impossible figure appear. He ran every diagnostic he could think of. The camera was undamaged. There were no smudges on the lens. The digital file showed no signs of corruption or manipulation. The EXIF data confirmed the photo was taken at an altitude of 91,243 feet, at a temperature of minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The students were buzzing with theories, from aliens to secret government projects to ghosts. Mr. Chen a man of science and reason, tried to find a logical explanation. He researched optical phenomena, ice crystal formations, and the effects of extreme radiation on digital sensors. The most plausible explanation he could find was a form of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns, like faces or figures in random data. Perhaps a unique combination of solar glare and ice crystals on the camera housing had created a shape that merely resembled a person. He presented this theory to his class, and for the sake of scientific rigor, it was the explanation they included in their final project report. The photograph was archived along with the rest of the project data, a single, anomalous frame in a successful experiment. But privately, Mr. Chen was not convinced. He had spent hours staring at that image, zooming in on the dark, slender shape. It didn't look random. It looked intentional. It looked like it was standing there, observing the camera as it passed by. The way it was positioned, the way it seemed to have weight and presence on that impossible patch of snow in the void, defied all rational explanation. He was haunted by the sheer wrongness of it. The emptiness of the stratosphere was supposed to be absolute. It was a place of pure physics, of predictable cold and unforgiving vacuum. But for 30 seconds, his student's humble science project had captured something that had no right to be there. The official school project archive labels the photo as a probable camera malfunction due to glare, but the image itself remains a chilling piece of data that suggests the empty spaces above us may not be as empty as we believe. Mr. Chen still teaches science, and his class still launches a weather balloon every winter. But now, when he watches it disappear into the high, thin air, he feels a sense of unease. He finds himself hoping that when the camera comes back down, all it will have captured is the beautiful, predictable, and blessedly empty sky. He is terrified that one day it will bring back another picture of the impossible figure standing in the snow, and this time it will be looking directly at the lens. The signal fire. The Wrangell Mountains are one of the last truly wild places in North America, a staggering landscape of towering peaks, vast glaciers, and endless untracked wilderness. For Cole Bishop, a seasoned hunting guide, this was his sanctuary and his office. In September of 2009, he was leading a small group on a multi-day sheep hunt deep in the backcountry. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, the tundra painted in fiery shades of red and gold. It was a time of year when the land was especially vulnerable to fire, and a strict burn ban was in effect across the entire region. On their third evening out, as twilight settled over the mountains, casting long, deep blue shadows across the valleys, Cole saw it. Far in the distance, perched on the crest of a high, nameless ridge, was a fire. It wasn't a large fire, just a single, steady point of orange light, the unmistakable flicker of a campfire. He pointed it out to his clients, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Looks like we've got some fools breaking the burn ban," he grumbled. The fire was at least 10 miles away, a tiny spark in the immense darkness. But in the clear, dry air, it was as obvious as a beacon. He was angry. A fire out here could quickly become an unstoppable inferno. He made a note of the coordinates, using the surrounding peaks as reference points. The next morning, he used his satellite phone to call it into the Bureau of Land Management Fire Watch. He gave them the location, describing the single, steady campfire he and his clients had all witnessed. The dispatcher on the other end thanked him and said they would send a spotter plane to investigate. The hunting trip continued, but Cole found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the distant ridge. The fire had been gone at sunrise, and he saw no smoke during the day. He assumed the careless campers had moved on. 2 days later, when he got back into cell range, he called the BLM for an update. The response he received was deeply unsettling. The fire dispatcher told him they had indeed sent a plane. The pilot had circled the ridge for an hour. There was no sign of a campfire, no ash, no fire ring, not even a footprint. The terrain on that particular ridge was brutal, a sheer rock face on one side and a treacherous scree slope on the other. The pilot had reported that there was no discernible access route to the summit. It was, for all practical purposes, an island in the sky. Furthermore, they had checked their satellite imaging archives. The heat-sensing satellites had picked up a faint thermal bloom at the exact coordinates Cole had given, at the exact time he had reported it. But the thermal signature was bizarre. It had appeared instantaneously, burned with a consistent, unwavering heat for exactly 12 minutes, and then vanished just as suddenly. It left no lingering heat signature in the rock, which a real fire would have done. Cole felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He and his 3 clients had watched that fire for over an hour before turning in for the night. It hadn't been a 12-minute event. It had been a steady, normal-looking campfire, flickering against the darkness. He tried to rationalize it. Could it have been some kind of atmospheric lensing? A distortion of light from a distant source? Perhaps the aurora borealis, though it was early in the season and there had been no activity reported. Could it have been a natural gas flare venting from the rock? Possible, but the steady, campfire-like flicker was hard to explain. He hung up the phone, a profound sense of unease settling over him. The wilderness he knew so well, a place of understandable, if harsh, realities, suddenly felt alien and mysterious. The memory of that small, distant light, burning where nothing should be, began to take on a sinister quality in his mind. It wasn't just a fire. It was a signal. But who was sending it? And from where? The official BLM Firewatch log for that date records the incident as a phantom thermal event, likely caused by atmospheric conditions or a sensor anomaly on the satellite. The eyewitness account from the hunting party is noted, but ultimately dismissed in the face of the physical evidence, or lack thereof. But Cole Bishop knows what he saw. He saw a fire on a mountaintop that no one could reach. He saw a light in a place of absolute desolation. The incident changed his relationship with the mountains. He still guides, still respects the raw power of the wilderness. But now, when he looks out at the vast, empty landscapes at twilight, he feels a sense of being watched. He thinks about that lonely, impossible fire, a beacon in the night. He wonders if it was a warning or an invitation. He's not sure which is more terrifying. He is certain of only one thing. They were not alone out there. Something else was in those mountains. Something old and patient. Something that could light a fire without fuel and leave no ash behind. Something that watches from the high, inaccessible places and occasionally, in the deep twilight, decides to let. You know that it is there. The Cold Dorm. The University of Alaska Fairbanks is a unique institution, a center of learning huddled against the edge of the vast, frozen interior. Its students are accustomed to the cold, but the winter of 2000 was particularly brutal, with temperatures plummeting to 40 below zero for weeks on end. For Sarah Jenkins, a residential advisor in one of the older dormitories on campus, her primary job was ensuring her residents were safe and, above all, warm. That February, she started getting complaints. all from the same hallway on the third floor of Bartlett Hall. The students were saying their rooms were freezing, that the heaters were blowing cold air. Sarah went to investigate, expecting to find a simple maintenance issue. When she stepped into the third floor north hallway, the change in temperature was immediate and shocking. The air was frigid, her breath pluming in front of her face. It felt like walking into a meat locker. She checked the thermostat in the hallway. It read 45 degrees Fahrenheit, an impossible temperature for an actively heated building. She went from room to room. The students, bundled in parkas and blankets, all told her the same story. The cold had started a few days ago and had been getting progressively worse. The radiators in their rooms were cold to the touch, but the complaints weren't just about the temperature. The students also spoke of strange occurrences at night. They heard doors slamming in the empty hallway long after everyone was asleep. They heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor in the vacant room at the end of the hall. One student swore she heard someone whispering her name from the heating vent in her room. Sarah was skeptical about the noises, attributing them to the building settling in the extreme cold. But the temperature anomaly was real and dangerous. She immediately called the university's physical plant. A team of engineers arrived, their faces grim and determined. They spent the entire day in Bartlett Hall, crawling through service tunnels and checking heating coils. Their findings only deepened the mystery. The heating system for the third floor north wing was functioning perfectly. The boilers were running at full capacity, and superheated water was being pumped through the pipes exactly as it should have been. They used thermal cameras and found that the pipes leading up to the third floor were glowing with heat. But the moment the pipes entered the affected hallway, the heat signature vanished. The pipes themselves and the radiators connected to them were inexplicably ice cold. It was as if something within that specific section of the building was actively consuming the heat, draining the energy out of the system. The engineers were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. To make matters even stranger, when they checked the power meters, they discovered that the building's electricity usage had spiked dramatically over the past few days, coinciding exactly with the drop in temperature. The building was drawing a massive amount of power, yet a section of it was freezing. The cold was not a passive absence of heat. It was an active, energy-consuming presence. The university had no choice but to relocate the students from the affected hallway. The section was closed off. Yellow caution tape stretched across the entrance. Sarah, feeling responsible for her residents, couldn't let it go. She dug into the university archives, looking for any information she could find about Bartlett Hall. She found a faded old campus newspaper from the 1960s that mentioned a tragic accident. A student, despondent over his grades, had died by suicide in one of the third-floor rooms during a particularly harsh winter break. The article noted he had left the window of his room wide open, and when his body was discovered days later, the room was frozen solid. His room number matched one of the now empty rooms in the cold hallway. A shiver went down Sarah's spine. The story was just an old campus ghost story, she told herself. But the facts were hard to ignore. The cold persisted in the sealed-off hallway for another week. Engineers monitored it, but no one entered. The slamming doors and other noises were still reported by students on the floor below. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The thermostats returned to their normal settings. The hallway warmed up. The massive power drain on the building ceased. The caution tape was removed, and students were allowed to move back in. There was no official explanation. The UAF facilities record from February 2000 logs the event as an unresolved HVAC anomaly. The engineers, in their private conversations, called it the heat vampire. For Sarah, the experience was a terrifying glimpse into a reality she couldn't explain. She had felt the cold, a physical, hungry presence that defied the laws of thermodynamics. She had heard the stories from her students, their fear palpable. She knew that the cold in that hallway wasn't just a lack of heat, it was something else, something that had briefly woken up from a long, cold sleep in the forgotten corner of an old building. She finished her term as an RA and moved off campus the following year. She never walked down the third-floor north hallway of Bartlett Hall again. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had caused the cold was still there, dormant and waiting, a chilling memory frozen in the very walls of the building, waiting for the next long, dark winter to awaken again. The ice cave collapse. The Mendenhall Glacier, a 13-mile-long river of ancient ice near Juneau, is a place of breathtaking and ever-changing beauty. For Alex, an adventure tour guide, the glacier's ice caves were his prized destination. These ethereal, otherworldly caverns were formed by melting water tunneling through the ice, creating cathedral-like spaces of brilliant, luminous blue. Leading tours there in January of 2014 was his passion, but he was always acutely aware of the dangers. Glaciers are not static. They are constantly moving, shifting, and calving. The ice caves were temporary, their existence measured in seasons, not years. On a cold, clear afternoon, Alex was leading a small group of 4 tourists into a newly formed cave system he had scouted the week before. The entrance was a low, wide arch at the glacier's edge. As they stooped to enter, he noticed something peculiar. A steady current of warm, damp air was flowing out of the cave entrance, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the outside world. It felt like the glacier was exhaling. He paused, a flicker of unease touching him. He'd felt drafts in caves before, but nothing like this. Nothing so warm and constant. He dismissed it as a strange pressure differential and led his clients inside. The interior of the cave was magnificent. The walls and ceiling were a deep sapphire blue, the ice so pure that it filtered the sunlight from above, bathing the entire cavern in an unearthly glow. The sound of dripping water echoed around them, the lifeblood of the glacier itself. The clients were mesmerized, taking photos, their voices hushed with awe. They explored deeper, moving through a series of interconnected chambers. The warm draft was still present, a gentle but persistent flow of air coming from deeper within the glacier. Alex kept a close watch on the ice, his trained eye looking for any signs of instability, any new cracks or fissures. Everything seemed solid. They had been inside for no more than 20 minutes when a deep, resonant groaning sound echoed through the cave. It was not the familiar creak of shifting ice. It was a deeper, more violent sound, like the tearing of a great beast. It was followed by a deafening crash that seemed to come from the direction of the entrance. The entire cave trembled, and a shower of ice dust rained down from the ceiling. Alex's blood ran cold. He knew instantly what had happened. Collapse. He hurried his terrified clients back the way they came, his mind racing. He prayed it was just a partial collapse, that their way out wasn't completely blocked. When they reached the main chamber, he saw that his worst fears were realized. The low archway they had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall of fractured, opaque ice, a massive slab that had cleaved from the roof and sealed the entrance completely. They were trapped. Panic began to set in among the group, their awe replaced with primal fear. Alex fought to keep his own terror at bay, his training kicking in. He was prepared for this. He had emergency supplies, and he had a satellite phone. He tried the phone first, but deep within the glacier, surrounded by tons of ice and rock, he couldn't get a signal. He told the group to stay calm, to conserve their energy and body heat. He had logged their route with his company. When they didn't return on time, a search party would be sent. Their only job now was to wait. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. The blue light of the cave began to fade as the sun set, plunging them into a deep, profound darkness, broken only by the thin beams of their headlamps. The silence was absolute. The only sound their own ragged breathing and the steady, maddening drip of melting water. The warm draft had stopped. The air in the cave grew still and frigid. It was in that cold, dark silence that Alex began to feel it, a sense of presence. It was the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by the ice itself. The glacier felt ancient, alive, and malevolent. The cave no longer felt like a natural wonder. It felt like a tomb, or the belly of some great sleeping creature that had just swallowed them whole. After what felt like an eternity, they heard a new sound. A distant, mechanical whining. A rescue team. They began to shout, to bang on the ice wall with their crampons, their hopes soaring. They heard the sounds of drilling, the whine of a powerful ice auger boring through the blockage. Finally, a small hole appeared, and a bright light shone through. A voice called out, "Is anyone in there?" The relief was overwhelming. The rescue team worked for another hour, carefully cutting away a larger section of the ice wall. When the opening was finally big enough to crawl through, Alex and his clients emerged, blinking, into the harsh floodlights of the rescue scene. They were safe. But as Alex looked back at the glacier, a new, chilling mystery presented itself. The rescuers hadn't been cutting through a collapsed pile of rubble. They had been drilling through the solid, intact face of the glacier. The cave entrance, as he knew it, was simply gone. It had been replaced by a smooth, seamless wall of ancient ice. There was no debris, no pile of fallen ice, no evidence of a collapse whatsoever. It was as if the glacier had simply healed itself, sealing the opening behind them. The rescue team was confused. Their thermal imagers had located the heat signatures of the trapped group inside the glacier, but on the surface there had been no sign of a cave. The official Juneau search and rescue log from January 2014 describes the event as a successful rescue of a tour group from a rapidly sealing ice cave. It notes that glacier caves are known for their instability, but Alex knew what he had seen. A collapse leaves evidence. This was different. This was an erasure. He never guided in the ice caves again. He couldn't shake the memory of that warm breath flowing from the mouth of the cave like an invitation. He couldn't forget the feeling of the ice as a living entity, a predator that had let them in, and then tried to keep them. He knew that for a few terrifying hours, he and his clients had been inside something that was not just ice, but a trap, a beautiful, luminous blue trap that had almost become their permanent, frozen grave. The abandoned tower. In the vast, sparsely populated interior of Alaska, the remnants of the Cold War lie rusting in the wilderness. Microwave relay towers, once vital links in a continental defense network, now stand as silent, skeletal sentinels on remote hilltops. In August of 1996, a young telecom rigger named Ben Carter was part of a crew contracted to inspect and formally decommission one of these towers. The job was simple: climb the 300-foot lattice of steel, assess its structural integrity for demolition, and ensure all power sources were disconnected. The tower was miles from any town, accessible only by a rough, overgrown service road. As Ben and his partner, a grizzled veteran named Frank, arrived at the site, a sense of profound isolation settled in. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the steel girders and the distant cry of a hawk. The small concrete bunker at the base of the tower that once housed the sensitive electronics was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay. The main power lines had been cut years ago, the transformers removed. The tower was a dead thing, a monument to a forgotten fear. Ben began his climb, his boots ringing on the metal rungs, the ground shrinking below him. He was equipped with a variety of tools, including a handheld spectrum analyzer, a device used to detect any stray radio frequencies. It was a routine safety check to ensure there were no active transmitters that could interfere with their own communication gear. Halfway up the tower, at around 150 feet, the analyzer in his belt pouch suddenly chirped to life. It was detecting a strong, clear signal. Ben paused his climb, confused. He pulled out the device. It was picking up a broadcast on a frequency that was supposed to be silent, a narrow, powerful band of microwave energy. He switched the device to audio output, and a voice flooded his headphones. It was a man speaking in Russian, his tone urgent and rapid. Ben didn't speak Russian, but he could tell it wasn't a random conversation. It was structured, formal, like a military transmission. He called down to Frank on his walkie-talkie. "Hey Frank, I'm getting something up here." A live signal. Sounds like Russian Frank's voice crackled back, incredulous. "You're kidding me. That tower's been dark for a decade. Must be atmospheric skip." Atmospheric skip? The phenomenon where radio waves bounce off the ionosphere could indeed carry signals for thousands of miles. A broadcast from Siberia could theoretically reach this remote Alaskan hilltop. It was the only logical explanation. But the signal was too strong, too clear. It was behaving like it was being broadcast from the dish antenna, just a few feet above Ben's head, not from thousands of miles away. He continued his climb, the Russian voice a constant, unintelligible stream in his ears. He reached the top platform, a small windswept space that offered a panoramic view of endless forest and distant mountains. He attached his safety line and began to inspect the large parabolic dish antenna. It was rusted and covered in lichen, its waveguide horn filled with a bird's nest. There was no physical way it could be transmitting. He pointed his analyzer directly into the dish. The signal strength maxed out. It was undeniably the source. The structured sentences repeated in a loop, lasting about 5 minutes before starting over. It was a recording, but what was powering the broadcast? He communicated his findings to his supervisor via satellite phone. The supervisor was adamant. The tower was cold. All power had been severed at the substation 12 years prior. He ordered Ben to record the signal for analysis. Ben connected his own digital recorder to the spectrum analyzer and captured a full hour of the mysterious broadcast. The voice continued its rhythmic, urgent monologue the entire time, a ghost in the machine speaking to no one. The feeling on top of that tower was deeply unsettling. The wind howled around him. The vast, empty wilderness stretched in every direction, and this impossible voice from a defunct piece of enemy technology chattered endlessly in his ears. It felt like a piece of the Cold War had never ended, that it was still being fought by phantoms in the empty spaces of the world. After he completed his inspection and climbed back down, the signal remained. It only faded when they drove several miles away from the tower, out of its line of sight. The next day, the story took an even stranger turn. Ben's supervisor had sent the recording to a specialist at the FCC for translation. The message was not military. It was a repeated, desperate-sounding civilian broadcast. The translation was chilling. "This is a test of the emergency system. Do not believe the official reports. The contamination is airborne. Stay indoors. Do not open your doors for anyone. We are broadcasting from a secure location. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The message contained no date, no specific location, just the same terrifying, looped warning. Further investigation into the tower's history revealed nothing. It had been a standard microwave relay, part of a chain that stretched across Alaska. There were no records of it ever being used for civilian emergency broadcasts, let alone Russian ones. The final report on the tower, filed with the FCC, notes the detection of a spurious signal of unknown origin, likely caused by a rare form of passive intermodulation, where a powerful external signal can cause a dead antenna to re-radiate energy. It was a technical handwave, an attempt to explain the unexplainable. Ben Carter never forgot that day. He had the recording, a digital file of a ghost's warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that the tower wasn't just re-radiating a signal. He felt that the tower itself had a memory, that the desperate, urgent events of some unknown past had been permanently imprinted onto its hardware. He wondered about the man whose voice he had heard. What emergency was he broadcasting about? What was the airborne contamination? And was his warning a relic of a crisis long past? Or was it a message that was still, somehow, waiting to be received? The abandoned tower was eventually demolished, its steel frame collapsing into the wilderness. But for Ben, it will forever stand in his memory, a silent monument on a lonely hilltop, forever broadcasting a terrifying warning in a dead language, a signal from nowhere about a disaster that may or may not have ever happened. The missing skier Alyeska Resort, nestled in the Chugach Mountains, is a paradise for skiers, known for its steep, challenging terrain and abundant snowfall. The Alyeska Ski Patrol is a team of elite mountaineers, responsible for the safety of everyone on the mountain. In March of 2008, on a brilliant, cold bluebird day after a heavy storm, a senior patroller named Jake was performing a final sweep of the upper mountain before closing. The slopes were mostly empty, the day skiers having already retreated to the warmth of the lodge. It was a time of day he loved, when the mountain grew quiet, and the low-angled sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the snow. As he skied down a ridge near the boundary of a permanently closed area known as the Headwall, a notoriously dangerous gully prone to avalanches, he saw something that made him stop. A single set of fresh ski tracks. They led directly from the main trail, under the rope line, and into the closed gully. Jake swore under his breath. It was a classic case of a reckless skier ducking a rope, looking for fresh powder, completely oblivious to the danger. With a sigh of resignation, he radioed his location to the patrol base, informing them he was going to follow the tracks and escort the skier back to safety. He clicked back into his skis and followed the trail. The tracks were clear and well-defined in the deep powder. The skier was skilled, carving smooth, confident turns down the steep pitch of the gully. Jake followed, his own skis hissing through the snow, the silence of the backcountry settling around him. The gully was eerily quiet, the massive rock walls on either side seeming to absorb all sound. As he descended deeper, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The tracks were strange, They were too perfect, too uniform. There were no signs of hesitation, no slight wobbles or corrections that even the best skiers make in deep, untracked snow. It was as if the skier was impossibly light, barely disturbing the surface. He followed the tracks for another quarter mile, down into the belly of the gully. Then he saw where they led, and his blood ran cold. The tracks stopped their descent and began to climb. They veered sharply to the left and went straight up the side of the gully, a 40-degree slope of unstable powder in a perfect, unwavering line. It was an impossible ascent. No skier, no matter how strong, could ski uphill in deep powder at that angle. It would be a strenuous climb, even with skins and specialized touring gear. And these tracks were made by downhill skis. Jake stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He was looking at evidence of a flagrant violation of the laws of physics. He continued to follow, his heart pounding, his earlier annoyance replaced with a growing sense of dread. He half expected to find the tracks ending in the telltale debris of an avalanche. But the snowpack was stable, untouched. The tracks climbed for several hundred feet, a perfect, straight line up the impossibly steep slope. They led directly to the edge of a massive cornice, a huge, overhanging lip of wind-blown snow at the top of the ridge. And there, at the very edge of the cornice, they simply stopped. The tracks went to the precipice, and then there was nothing. No signs of a fall, no body, no discarded equipment in the snow below, no tracks leading away. It was as if the skier had reached the edge and had simply vanished into thin air. Jake stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping at his jacket, trying to make sense of the scene. He searched the area meticulously. He called in a larger search party. For the next 3 days, the ski patrol and a mountain rescue team scoured every inch of that gully and the surrounding terrain. They used probes, search dogs, and even a helicopter with a thermal camera. They found nothing. There were no reports of a missing person from the resort or the local town. No one had been reported overdue. The skier, whoever they were, had seemingly come from nowhere and returned to the same place. The official ski patrol incident card from March 2008 records the event as an unidentified track investigation. It speculates that high winds and blowing snow could have obscured the skier's exit tracks, or that the skier, an expert in backcountry survival, had managed to leave the area without being seen. It's a tidy, rational explanation that satisfies the requirements of a report. But Jake knows it's not the truth. He was there. The wind was calm that day, the tracks sharp and clear. He saw them with his own eyes. He saw them defy gravity. He saw them lead to an ending that made no sense. The story of the phantom skier of the headwall became a quiet legend among the veteran patrollers at Alaskan, a cautionary tale whispered on stormy nights. For Jake, it was a permanent and unsettling memory. It changed the way he saw the mountain. He had always seen it as a thing of raw, natural power, a place of understandable risks and challenges. But since that day, he sees it as something more. He sees it as a place of deep and ancient mysteries, a place where the rules don't always apply. He still does his final sweep at the end of the day. But now, when he sees a lone set of tracks heading towards a closed boundary, he feels a shiver of fear. He follows them because it's his job, but he prays they end in a way that makes sense, that they belong to a person of flesh and blood. He is terrified that one day he will again follow a set of perfect, impossible tracks to the edge of a cliff and be left alone with the chilling, absolute certainty that whatever made them was not from this world. The portage echo, The Portage Valley in Alaska is a place shaped by immense geological forces, a landscape of hanging glaciers, towering mountains, and the remnants of the catastrophic 1964 earthquake. In May of 1985, a road crew was working in the valley, a noisy, diesel-fueled operation of jackhammers and heavy machinery, repairing a section of road damaged by spring thaws. For Mike, a young crew member on his first big job, it was hard, loud, and honest work. The valley walls rose steeply on either side, creating a natural amphitheater that amplified the cacophony of their work, the sound of metal on rock echoing endlessly. At precisely 3 p.m., the foreman called for a break. The generators were shut down, the jackhammers fell silent, and the crew retreated to their trucks for coffee. A sudden, profound silence descended on the valley, a stark contrast to the industrial noise of moments before. But the silence didn't last. A few seconds after their own jackhammer went quiet, the sound started up again. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic pounding of a jackhammer, just as loud and clear as their own had been, echoing from the face of the nearby Portage Glacier. Mike and the rest of the crew turned and stared. They were the only work crew for miles. There was no one on the glacier. The sound was a perfect mimic of their own equipment. The same cadence, the same metallic ring. It continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped. The crew looked at each other, confused. The foreman, a man who had worked in these mountains his whole life, just grunted. "Rock glaciers," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "They do that sometimes. Trap the sound and spit it back out." It was a plausible explanation. The valley was filled with rock glaciers, slow-moving masses of ice and debris, which were known to create strange acoustic effects. The crew shrugged and went back to their break, dismissing it as a local curiosity. But when the break ended and they started their equipment back up, the phenomenon became far more bizarre. They worked for another hour, the valley once again filled with the roar of their labor. At 4 p.m., they shut everything down for the day, and once again, moments after their own noise ceased, the echo started. But this time, it wasn't just a brief reverberation. It was a perfect, full-length replay of their last hour of work. They stood in stunned silence as the valley filled with the phantom sounds of their own labor. They heard the specific sputtering start of their generator, the high-pitched whine of a specific power saw, and the relentless, pounding rhythm of the jackhammer. It wasn't just an echo. It was a recording. The spectral noise continued, unabated, for a full 17 minutes, a ghostly reenactment of their day. The sound was directional, seeming to emanate from the deep crevasses of the glacier and the massive, shattered rock faces above it. The feeling was deeply unnerving. It was as if the valley itself had recorded them and was now playing it back. The men, hardened construction workers, not given to flights of fancy, grew quiet and edgy. They packed up their tools in a hurry, eager to leave the valley before sunset. One of the project's geologists had set up seismic monitoring equipment in the area to study the glacier's movement. When he reviewed the data from that afternoon, he found something extraordinary. During the period the road crew was working, the seismic loggers recorded the heavy vibrations of their machinery, as expected. But for 17 minutes after the crew had packed up and left, the loggers continued to pick up identical vibrations, a perfect match in frequency and intensity to the jackhammer. There was no equipment running, yet the ground itself was trembling with a phantom memory of the noise. The official DOT construction log from May 1985 makes a brief note of unusual acoustic and seismic reverberations, attributing them to the unique geology of the Portage Valley. It was filed away and forgotten, but for the men on that road crew, it was an experience they would never forget. Mike, the young crew member, was particularly affected. He had felt the phantom vibrations through the soles of his boots. He had heard the ghostly replay of his own work echoing from the ice. It was as if the glacier, a living, moving thing, had listened to them, learned their sounds, and was now mimicking them. Why? Was it a warning? A curiosity? A form of communication? He didn't have an answer. He only knew that the experience had fundamentally changed his perception of the world. He realized that the rocks and ice were not just passive materials to be drilled and blasted. They were witnesses. They held on to things. He left the construction trade a few years later, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that came with making loud noises in quiet, ancient places. He would forever be haunted by the memory of the Portage Echo, the chilling realization that when you make a mark on the wilderness, sometimes the wilderness marks you back, remembering your sounds and playing them back to you in the silence, long after you are gone. The fuel gauge, a medevac flight in the rugged archipelago of Southeast Alaska, is a high-stakes race against time. For Captain Maya Flores, a pilot with a reputation for being calm under pressure, a flight from Sitka to Juneau in June of 2019 was all in a day's work. Her aircraft was a state-of-the-art turboprop, packed with advanced avionics and medical equipment. Her patient was in critical condition, a man who had suffered a severe heart attack, and he was hooked up to a host of monitors that tracked his every vital sign. The flight started smoothly. The weather was clear, the air calm. Maya and her co-pilot ran through their checklists, their movements efficient and practiced. The two flight nurses in the back worked quietly, tending to the patient. Everything was nominal. About 20 minutes into the flight, as they cruised at 15,000 feet over the vast, empty expanse of the Gulf of Alaska, Maya noticed something on her instrument panel that made her frown. The digital fuel gauge. It was climbing. She watched it for a full minute, her brow furrowed in disbelief. The numbers were ticking steadily upwards, indicating that the aircraft was somehow gaining fuel as it flew. This was, of course, a physical impossibility. A plane consumes fuel. It doesn't generate it. Her first thought was a sensor malfunction, a faulty gauge. She cross-referenced with the secondary fuel flow indicators. They showed a normal rate of consumption, yet the primary gauge, the one she was trained to rely on, continued its impossible ascent. "You seeing this?" she asked her co-pilot, a young, unflappable man named David. He stared at the gauge, his eyes wide. "That's not right." They immediately began running through the emergency procedures for instrument failure. They checked the circuit breakers, cycled the power to the avionics bus, and tried to reboot the flight management system. Nothing worked. The fuel gauge continued to climb, its bright green numbers a mocking refutation of the laws of physics. A faulty fuel gauge, while not immediately catastrophic, is a serious issue. Without an accurate reading, they wouldn't know their true fuel state. A dangerous situation when flying over hundreds of miles of icy water and remote wilderness. The tension in the cockpit rose. They were in constant communication with maintenance on the ground, trying to troubleshoot the problem, but no one had ever heard of a gauge failing in this specific way. It was always the other way around. Then, one of the flight nurses called from the back. Her voice was strained. "Captain, We're getting some strange readings on the patient's EKG. His heart rhythm is all over the place, but it's syncing up with some kind of electrical pulse in the cabin. Maya felt a sudden, intuitive flash of insight. She looked at the fuel gauge, which was now oscillating, the numbers rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Then she looked at the feed from the patient's heart monitor, which was displayed on a small screen in the cockpit. The two were moving in perfect unison. The fuel gauge was rising and falling in exact sync with the erratic, desperate beating of the dying man's heart in the back of the plane. It was impossible. There was no connection between the medical equipment and the aircraft's fuel sensors. They operated on completely separate, shielded systems. Yet the evidence was right in front of her. The plane's instruments were somehow linked to the biological processes of her patient. The aircraft was not just a machine. It had become an extension of the man fighting for his life in the cabin. The feeling was profoundly disturbing, a violation of the clear, hard lines between man and a machine, between biology and engineering. The rest of the flight was a tense, surreal experience. Maya and her co-pilot ignored the primary fuel gauge, relying on their backup instruments and calculations, but they couldn't stop watching it, the digital numbers pulsing in time with the life and death struggle happening just a few feet behind them. When the patient's heart would stabilize for a moment, the fuel gauge would hold steady. When he went into distress, the numbers would fluctuate wildly. They landed safely in Juneau, and the patient was rushed to the hospital. The moment the patient was wheeled off the aircraft and the medical monitors were shut down, the fuel gauge on the instrument panel snapped back to a normal, accurate reading. It was as if a spell had been broken. The maintenance crew at Juneau spent the next 2 days tearing the plane's avionics apart. They could not find a single thing wrong with the fuel gauge or its sensors. The official FAA maintenance log from that flight records the incident as a case of unresolved electromagnetic interference, suggesting that the powerful medical equipment might have temporarily coupled with the avionics sensors. It's a plausible technical-sounding explanation, but Maya Flores knows it was more than that. She was in the cockpit. She saw the perfect, eerie synchronization. She felt the boundary between her highly advanced, rational machine and the fragile, chaotic human body it was carrying simply dissolve. She had witnessed a moment of true ghost in the machine. A moment when the desperate life force of a dying man had imprinted itself onto the cold, digital heart of her aircraft. She continues to fly medevac missions, but the experience left a permanent mark. Sometimes on long, quiet flights, she'll look at the steady green numbers of her fuel gauge and remember that one impossible flight when the gauge had a heartbeat. The lighthouse keeper's note. The Five Finger Islands. Lighthouse is a lonely sentinel, a stark white tower standing on a small, windswept rock in the middle of Alaska's Stevens Passage. For generations, it was manned by hardy keepers who lived a life of profound isolation. By September of 1993, the lighthouse was automated, its powerful light controlled from afar, but it still required upkeep, a job that fell to a small group of dedicated volunteers. One of these was a retired history professor named Arthur Croft. Arthur loved the solitude of the lighthouse. He would spend a week at a time on the small island, performing routine maintenance, polishing the massive lens, and losing himself in the history of the place. The keeper's quarters were left just as they had been, a small museum of a bygone era. He spent his evenings reading the old logbooks, the meticulous handwritten accounts of storms, shipwrecks, and the simple, daily routines of the men who had kept the light burning. During one of his stays, Arthur was organizing a collection of loose papers he had found in a desk in the keeper's old office. Most of it was mundane. Supply lists, weather notations, tide charts. But then he found a single loose page that made him pause. It was a journal entry, written in a neat, looping cursive with a fountain pen. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age, and there were faint, brownish water spots scattered across it, as if it had gotten damp at some point. But what stunned Arthur was the date at the top of the page. It was dated for that very day, September 14th, 1993. His heart began to pound. He was the only person on the island. He had been for 4 days. He read the entry, his confusion turning to a cold, creeping dread. The handwriting was not his own, yet the words described his day with impossible accuracy. Replace the burnt-out bulb in the engine room, it began. Clean the salt spray from the main lantern glass. A pod of humpbacks passed to the west at midday. Weather holding clear, but the barometer is falling. Arthur had done every single one of those things. He had replaced the engine room bulb that morning. He had spent an hour meticulously cleaning the giant Fresnel lens. He had watched, mesmerized, as a family of humpback whales breached in the distance, a sight he had noted in his own personal log. The entry was a perfect verbatim account of his own chores and observations. He stared at the faded ink, the elegant, old-fashioned script. It was as if someone had been shadowing him all day, invisibly recording his actions. He searched the rest of the papers, the entire lighthouse, looking for any other explanation. There was none. The pages that should have followed the entry were blank. The journal it had come from long gone. He was utterly alone. The feeling of solitude he had once cherished now felt menacing, oppressive. The silence of the lighthouse was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. He felt as if he had stumbled upon a crack in time, a place where the past and present had bled into one another. He thought about the men who had lived and died in this place, their lives dictated by the same simple, repetitive tasks he was now performing. Had one of them left this impossible note for him? Was it a message, a warning, or just a strange temporal echo? He tried to rationalize it. Could he have written it himself in some kind of fugue state and simply forgotten? He looked at the handwriting again. It was nothing like his own hurried scrawl. The ink was clearly old, faded in a way that modern ink does not. The paper felt ancient. The official explanation, as noted in the USCG facility caretaker file, is that the note was likely a remarkable coincidence. An old, undated journal entry whose described activities just happened to align with Arthur's own. The water spots and aged ink, they said, could create the illusion of a recent date. The numbers, perhaps, misread. But Arthur Croft knew what he saw. He saw his own day, a day that had just happened, chronicled in a hand from a century before. He finished his week on the island, but the joy was gone, replaced by a constant, unnerving feeling of being observed by the ghosts of the lighthouse. He felt like an actor in a play that had been written long ago, his movements and tasks preordained, just another verse in the long, repeating poem of the lighthouse keeper's life. He never volunteered for caretaker duty on Five Finger Island again. The experience left him with a profound and unsettling question. Do we move through time, or does time move through us? He feared he knew the answer. The note was proof that in that lonely, isolated place, the daily routine was an eternal loop, and he had simply been the latest person to step into the role. His actions already recorded, his presence just a fleeting echo in a story that had been written long, long ago. The oil derrick. The North Slope of Alaska is an alien landscape, a vast, flat tundra that is locked in ice and darkness for most of the year. It is a place of brutal cold, and immense industrial power, where colossal oil derricks stand like steel dinosaurs against the aurora-lit sky. For Kurt, a roughneck working on a drilling rig in the dead of the Arctic winter in December of 2007, life was a cycle of grueling 12-hour shifts, bone-numbing cold, and the constant deafening roar of the machinery. The rig was an isolated island of light and noise in a sea of absolute darkness and silence. One night, during a routine drilling operation, a strange anomaly appeared on the sensor readouts in the control room. The derrick, the towering structure that supported the drill string, was registering a subtle but persistent weight shift. The load sensors on the main catwalks, high up on the structure, were fluctuating as if something heavy was moving around up there. The driller, a burly man named Gus, checked the weather feeds. The wind was calm, the air still and frigid. There was no meteorological reason for the structure to be trembling. "Kurt, you and Dave go up and take a look," Gus ordered over the intercom, or probably just a sensor acting up in the cold. Kurt and his partner bundled up and stepped out of the warm control room into the biting, sub-zero air. They began the long, cold climb up the derrick's steel ladders, their headlamps cutting sharp beams through the darkness. As they ascended, they could feel it. The entire structure was vibrating, a low-frequency hum that resonated through the steel and into their bones. It wasn't the familiar, powerful shudder of the drilling operation deep below. This was a different vibration, a strange, rhythmic tremor that seemed to be originating from the top of the derrick itself. They reached the main catwalk, a narrow platform over 100 feet above the rig floor. The trembling was more pronounced here. The steel grating beneath their boots was humming like a tuning fork. They swept their lights across the platform. It was empty. There was nothing there but frost-covered equipment and the vast, star-filled darkness of the Arctic night. They checked the sensors, tapping on their housings, but they all seemed secure. Yet, the readings in the control room continued to show a shifting, phantom weight on the catwalk. The feeling up there was deeply unsettling. The immense, empty landscape, the profound silence between gusts of wind, and the inexplicable, rhythmic trembling of the massive steel structure created a sense of primal dread. It felt like the derrick was alive, that it was shivering not from the cold, but from something else. They climbed back down, unable to find any cause for the anomaly. The logbook for that night, filed with the British Petroleum Drilling Operations, notes the event as a sensor malfunction due to extreme temperatures. But the anomaly didn't stop. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. For 4 consecutive nights, at around the same time, the derrick would begin to tremble, its sensors registering the movement of an invisible, heavy presence on its upper levels. The crew grew tense and superstitious. The men started telling stories, whispering about old Inuit legends of spirits of the air, of things that lived in the wind and the darkness. Kurt, a rationalist, tried to dismiss it. He knew that extreme temperature swings could cause steel to contract and expand, creating strange stresses in a structure this large. It was the most logical explanation. On the 4th night, Kurt was in the control room, watching the sensor feeds. The familiar, rhythmic fluctuation began. But this time, it was accompanied by a sound, a faint, metallic scraping noise carried over the external microphones. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the steel catwalk high above. Gus, the driller, turned to Kurt, his face pale in the glow of the monitors. "There's something up there." Without another word, Kurt grabbed a powerful spotlight and went outside. He pointed the beam upwards towards the top of the derrick. The light cut a brilliant white comb through the darkness, illuminating the high catwalk. It was empty, but as he held the light steady, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. A series of long, deep scratches were being gouged into the thick frost on the steel decking of the catwalk. He was watching them appear in real time, a set of parallel lines, as if from giant claws, were being scraped into the surface by an unseen force. The scraping sound was clearly audible now, a harsh, grating noise that echoed in the still, cold air. The weight sensors in the control room went haywire. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The trembling ceased, the scraping sound vanished, and the sensors returned to normal. Kurt kept the spotlight trained on the catwalk until his arms ached. The next morning, he and Dave climbed the derrick again. The scratches were there, deep gouges not just in the frost, but in the galvanized steel beneath. They were physical, undeniable proof that something had been up there with them in the darkness. The incident was never officially explained. The operations log was amended to note surface damage to catwalk from suspected icefall. But everyone on the crew knew that was a lie. There was no falling ice that night. Kurt finished his rotation and left the north slope. The image of those scratches appearing out of thin air burned into his memory. He was left with the terrifying certainty that the vast, empty darkness of the Arctic is not empty at all. It is home to things that are ancient, powerful, and drawn to the temporary islands of light and noise that men build in their domain. Things that can climb, things that have weight, and things that leave scratches in solid steel just to let you know you are not welcome. The museum storage. The Anchorage Museum is a modern, elegant building, a repository of Alaskan history and art. But beneath the bright, welcoming galleries lies a different world. The collection's storage. It is a vast, climate-controlled labyrinth of sealed vaults, rolling shelves, and endless drawers. A place where the bulk of the museum's artifacts are kept in a state of carefully preserved slumber. For Elena, a young curator working late one night in October of 2010, the storage area was a place of quiet reverence. She was working on a new exhibit, and she needed to retrieve a set of Tlingit ceremonial masks from a high-security vault known as Archive C. The vault was a place of profound silence. The air kept at a constant temperature and humidity. The only sound was the soft hum of the environmental controls. As she was preparing to leave her office, a security alert popped up on her computer. A motion detector had been triggered in Archive C. Elena frowned. No one was supposed to be in there. She called security, and the guard on duty confirmed the alarm. He said it was probably a false alarm, that the old sensors were sensitive and could be set off by a draft from the HVAC system or even a small rodent. He told her he would do a remote reset. He did, but a few minutes later, the alarm went off again. And then, again. Something was repeatedly tripping the motion sensor in the sealed vault. Feeling a mixture of annoyance and a faint whisper of unease, Elena took the elevator down to the basement, meeting the security guard at the heavy steel door of Archive C. Following protocol, they opened the vault together. The lights hummed on, revealing the long, sterile aisles of metal shelving. Everything appeared to be in its place. The air was still and cold. They walked the perimeter, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no pests, nothing out of the ordinary. They concluded it must be a faulty sensor and logged the event. But the next night, it happened again. The same motion detector, in the same aisle, triggered repeatedly. This time, when Elena and the guard entered the vault, They noticed something was wrong. A series of flat file drawers containing delicate historical documents, drawers that Elena knew had been closed and locked, were now slightly ajar. A box of catalog cards, which had been in perfect alphabetical order, was now scattered across a tabletop. It wasn't vandalism. Nothing was damaged. It was more like a subtle, mischievous rearranging. The feeling in the vault was different now. The quiet reverence Elena usually felt was replaced by a palpable sense of presence. It felt like they had interrupted something, like the room had been holding its breath and was now waiting for them to leave. The museum's facilities director ordered a review of the security camera footage. The camera in that aisle was an older model, its images grainy and low resolution. The footage showed the aisle, empty and still, but as they watched the playback from the time of the motion alerts, they saw it. Shadows. Not the normal, static shadows cast by the shelving units, but amorphous, dark shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own. They flowed across the floor, coalesced in corners, and darted across the open spaces, their movements corresponding perfectly to the times the motion detector had been triggered. They were like clouds of ink spilled in water, moving with a silent, unnatural grace. There was no source for these moving shadows. The lighting in the vault was constant, and nothing was physically moving in the aisle to cast them. The official facilities report from that week is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It cites intermittent sensor malfunctions due to electrical fluctuations, and notes that the displaced items were likely the result of vibrations from a nearby construction project. The shadowy images on the security footage were dismissed as digital artifacts caused by low-light sensor noise. But Elena knew that wasn't the truth. She had been in that room. She had felt the charged atmosphere, the feeling of being an intruder in a silent, secret world. She believed that the vault, filled with objects that held the weight of so much human history, so many lives and ceremonies and stories, had developed a memory of its own. The Tlingit masks, the Yupik carvings, the Aleut hunting tools, these were not just inanimate objects. They were vessels of spirit and tradition. She began to think that at night, in the deep, curated silence of the museum's basement, these spirits would awaken. They would emerge from their climate-controlled slumber, not as ghosts, but as living shadows, a silent, spectral community moving through the aisles, rearranging their world, whispering the old stories to each other in a language that only this silence could understand. She never went into Archive C alone again. Her professional, scientific view of the world had been permanently altered. She understood that a museum is not just a place where the past is stored. It is a place where the past is still alive, and where, if you are not careful, you might accidentally walk into a room where it is very, very busy. The blinking runway marker. The Ralph Wien Memorial Airport in Kotzebue is a vital lifeline, a strip of civilization on the edge of the Chukchi Sea. For bush pilots like veteran aviator Sam Gable, it was a familiar and welcome sight after long hours flying over the vast, empty tundra. In April of 1990, Sam was on his final approach to Kotzebue late at night. The weather was clear, but the darkness was absolute. A profound, inky blackness that swallowed the landscape. The only lights were the stars above and the faint, reassuring line of the runway lights ahead. Sam was a pilot who trusted his eyes and his instincts as much as his instruments. He flew a rugged, dependable de Havilland Beaver, an aircraft he knew better than his own home. As he lined up for landing, his gaze swept across the runway markers, the blue lights that defined the edge of the taxiway. One of them was blinking, This was immediately wrong. Runway markers are steady, solid lights. A blinking light means an outage or a malfunction. But this light wasn't just blinking randomly. It was flashing in a clear, deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes, dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. It was Morse code. It was flashing SOS. Sam felt a jolt of adrenaline. SOS is the universal signal of distress. Was there an emergency on the ground? A vehicle disabled on the runway? He immediately keyed his radio. Kotzebue Tower. This is Beaver November 73 Alpha. I'm on final, and I see a runway marker flashing an SOS. Can you confirm an emergency on the field? The controller's voice came back, calm and unconcerned. Negative 73 Alpha. The field is clear. We're showing all runway lighting systems are green. No reported outages. Sam stared out the cockpit window. The light was still there, blinking its desperate message in the darkness. It was the third marker from the end of the runway on the left side. It was as clear as day. Tower, I'm telling you, I have a visual on a flashing marker. He insisted. It's blinking SOS. You better send a ground crew to check it out. There was a pause. Then the controller, with a hint of weary patience in his voice, replied, Roger, 73 Alpha. We'll send someone to take a look. You are cleared to land. Sam landed the Beaver safely, his eyes still locked on the strange, blinking light as he taxied past it. It continued its silent, urgent plea all the way until he shut down the engine at the terminal. He was met on the tarmac by a member of the ground crew who had just driven out to inspect the light. The man's face was a mask of confusion. There's nothing wrong with that marker, Sam, he said, gesturing back down the runway. But that's not the weird part. The damn thing was unplugged. He explained that he had found the marker, light completely disconnected from its power source. The heavy-duty plug was lying in the snow a few feet away from the socket. There was no physical way it could have been lit, let alone blinking. Sam felt a deep, unsettling chill. He had seen the light. It wasn't a vague impression. It was a clear, distinct signal. He went with the ground crew member back to the marker. It was exactly as the man had described. Cold, dark, and completely disconnected. They plugged it back in and it lit up with a steady, normal blue light. It did not blink. Sam was shaken. He was a pilot with over 15,000 hours of flight time. He didn't see things. He knew the difference between reality and illusion. He filed a pilot safety report with the FAA, a formal document describing the incident. He also had a hunch. His plane was equipped with an early model of a cockpit video recorder, a bulky device that recorded the view out the front window. He had it running on every flight. He took the tape to the station manager's office and played it back. The footage was grainy, but the approach was clear. As the plane descended, the runway lights came into view. And there it was, on the video, plain as day. The third marker on the left, blinking a clear, unmistakable SOS against the darkness. They watched the tape 3 times. The video evidence was irrefutable. It showed a light flashing from a source that was verifiably, physically unpowered. The FAA's official explanation, as noted in the safety report, was a classic case of pilot illusion, likely caused by fatigue and the hypnotic effect of staring at lights in the dark, a phenomenon known as autokinesis. The video evidence was dismissed as a potential reflection of the plane's own strobe lights on the marker's lens, a theory that Sam knew was nonsense given the specific coded pattern of the flashes. For Sam Gable, the incident was a stark reminder that the world doesn't always operate according to a checklist. He had seen a distress signal from a ghost in the electrical grid, a plea for help from a machine that had no voice. He never found out what the signal meant or why it was sent, but he could never again look at a line of runway lights without a flicker of unease. He would always remember that one light that cried for help in the vast, cold darkness of the Arctic night, a silent, impossible message that he was the only one to see. It left him with the chilling thought that some emergencies are seen only by those who are meant to see them, broadcast on a frequency that has nothing to do with electricity. The icebreaker track. The USCGC Healy is one of the most powerful icebreakers in the world, a behemoth of steel designed to conquer the frozen wilderness of the Arctic Ocean. In August of 2015, it was on a scientific mission deep within the polar ice pack, charting the sea floor and studying the effects of climate change. Aboard was a young research assistant named Ben, his job to monitor the ship's navigation systems and ensure the accuracy of their data. The world outside the ship was a surreal, monotonous landscape of white ice and gray water, stretching to a horizon that was often indistinct. The Healy moved with a relentless grinding power, its reinforced hull smashing through ice floes with a sound like thunder. The ship's path was supposed to be a straight line, a precise transect across a previously unexplored section of the ocean. Ben sat in the ship's science lab, a warm, bright room filled with the hum of computers, a stark contrast to the hostile environment outside. He was watching the ship's track on a large monitor, a green line representing their path overlaid on a satellite map of the ice. That's when he noticed the anomaly. According to the GPS, the Healy, a 16,000-ton vessel over 400 feet long, had just completed a perfect, tight circle and was now plowing over its own wake. Ben stared at the screen, baffled. He had been on the bridge just minutes before. The helmsman was steering a dead-straight course. The ship's engines were running steady. There had been no sensation of turning. He radioed the bridge. "Bridge, this is science. Our GPS track is showing we've just gone in a loop. Can you confirm your heading?" The officer on watch replied, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of annoyance. "Negative, science. We've been on a constant heading of 090 for the last 3 hours. We're going straight. Your GPS must be on the Fritz. Ben checked the secondary navigation systems. The ship's own inertial navigation and gyro compass all confirmed the bridge's report. They were on a linear path, but the primary and secondary GPS receivers, the gold standard of modern navigation, both showed that the ship was carving a series of perfect, overlapping circles in the ice. He pulled up the engine logs. They confirmed a constant, steady output, with no of the differential thrust that would be required to turn a ship of that size. The physical evidence of the ship's own systems was in direct contradiction to the satellite data. It was as if the ship existed in two places at once, following two different paths simultaneously. The crew on the bridge insisted they were going straight. The crew in the engine room felt no change in their workload, but the green line on Ben's screen continued to draw loops. He went out on deck, into the brutal, freezing wind. He looked back at the ship's wake. The channel they had just carved through the ice was a perfectly straight line, stretching back to the horizon. There were no circles. Yet, when the satellite imagery was updated a few hours later, showing a high-resolution photograph of their position, the loops were there. Carved into the vast sheet of Arctic ice were three perfect, massive circles, their edges sharp and clear, tracking the exact path the GPS had claimed the ship had taken. The photograph showed a path the ship had physically created, but that the crew had no memory of making. The disconnect was absolute, a chilling schism between human experience and technological record. The official explanation, as noted in the USCG navigation archive from that mission, was a rare and severe case of GPS multipath error, a phenomenon that can occur in polar latitudes where satellite signals are weak and can bounce off the ice and atmosphere, creating false position readings. The circles on the satellite image were dismissed as a bizarre optical illusion, a trick of shadow and light on the ice. But the scientists and crew who were on that voyage knew it was more than that. Ben had seen the data in real time. He had stood on the deck and seen the straight wake with his own eyes, and then later saw the photographic proof of the impossible circles. The experience created a deep sense of dislocation, a feeling that the very fabric of reality in that remote and desolate place was thin and unreliable. It was as if the ship had been captured by a strange, local anomaly, a vortex in space-time that had trapped them in a looping path without their knowledge. They were haunted by a single, terrifying question. Which path was the real one? The one the crew remembered? Or the one the satellites had recorded? The incident left them with the chilling realization that in the vast, white emptiness of the polar regions, the laws of navigation and even of memory itself can become dangerously unmoored, and that a straight line may not always be the shortest or the safest path between 2 points.